Okay, how are you guys today? Good. Can I answer any questions for you before we get started? All right. You want to just call it quits right here? It's the end of the semester. I start getting tired. I make that offer for a class, and then they say yes, and I feel bad because I have to go, no, I was just kidding. Yeah. Okay, anyway, what I wanted to talk about for starters today is a quick, light little subject, just kind of almost a little mention and demonstrate type thing, and that is Rubygems. Rubygems were something we talked about back in the Ruby class, right? I think we talked about gems back in the Ruby class, right? So we know that basically what a gem is a little packaged library of Ruby code, right? We saw that there were lots and lots of gems that existed out in the world. We played with them a little bit back in some of our Ruby projects. Well, Rubygems, of course, obviously still exist and are very heavily used in Rails. Rails itself, for example, is a Ruby gem. Active Record, right? All the different parts that we consider Rails, all the different parts that make up Rails are basically all just gems that are built here into our projects and set up and configured so that they make everything work automatically. But there are lots and lots of other gems that are also available that we may, for one reason or another, choose to include into Rails projects that we work on. Like a few weeks ago, a week ago, whenever it was, when we were talking about authentication and authorization, I mentioned that when those things are done fairly simply, I'm happy to just go ahead and write them myself. But whenever I start getting into deeper water, whenever the requirements start becoming more complex, a lot of times I prefer to use a pre-written authentication or authorization gem, right? So one way or another, lots of gems out there that can be very useful in Rails projects. I wanted to point out a couple of websites to you. I can't remember which of these I may or may not have shown to you previously, so I thought I'd just show them to you again. The first one is the main gems website, which is rubygems.org. Whenever we install gems, this is where the gems are actually coming from. So this is basically the clearinghouse, the main repository of pretty much all available gems that are there for us to be able to use. Right? We access this website from the command line by using the gem command, so we can do things like gem install and give it the name of a gem. It'll automatically pull down and install the gem for us. Right? They also out here on the website have a search feature, which sometimes comes in handy. If I had heard about a gem, or maybe I had Googled for a gem and found something that sounded like something I might like to try, something I might like to use in a project, I could always come out here to their website and I could search for it. So when we were talking about authentication, I mentioned a gem to you called devise. If I come out to rubygems.org and search for devise, right, it tracks that one particular gem down for me as the exact match, right, along with some other gems that are sort of add-ons to devise. Right? If I go ahead and click on the devise gem, it says I can install it straight on the command line by doing gem install devise. It has links to download it, to subscribe to its RSS feed, lists of the people who work on it, link to its homepage, its source code, all that good sort of stuff. Right? Here inside this little sort of black box is the part that would be most important to me in a Rails project, this little line right here. Because one thing that's a little bit different in Rails, as opposed to just sort of a little standalone Ruby script, is that gems are packaged, are bundled, and are handled in sort of a more automated and structured manner in a Rails project than they would be if we were just kind of one-off playing with gems in a Ruby script we wrote, right? There have been numerous times in this class where we've gone out to our Rails project's root directory and we've accessed this file called gemfile. Right? This gemfile file, right, is basically sort of a configuration script for another gem that comes built in, if you want to use that word, into a Rails project called Bundler. And what Bundler is essentially there to do is to help us manage our gems. Back in the old days, before they used Bundler in Rails projects, what would happen was that a Rails project would act just like any other script, any other Ruby script you might write, where essentially you would by hand install the gems you needed, and that would enable you to be able to run the script you wrote. But if you then took that script to a different computer, if you shared it to somebody else, they would have to ferret out by looking at the code or look at some documentation you had created to be able to figure out which gems needed to be installed and what versions of those gems needed to be available in order for that script to be able to run. In Rails, that problem was compounded because of the large number of gems that are often used by Rails projects. So in the more modern version of Rails projects, they started using this program, this gem called Bundler. Right? So basically the way Bundler works is that we have this gem file. Inside the gem file, we specifically say what gems we need to use. So for starters, up here at the very top of most every gem file is the version of Rails that we're using. Right? It has gem Rails, that's simply the name of the gem, and then over here it has a specific version number. Right? What would happen then when I run Bundler is Bundler would check in the current environment and it would see if that very specific version of Rails was already installed or not. If it was not, then it would install it for us. It would actually, though, also go further than that, in that when it installed the Rails gem itself would have specified dependencies. It would say, in order for me to work correctly, I need this gem and that version, and this other gem and this version, right? And Bundler then would take care of all those as well, basically install all the dependencies of the dependencies, so on and so forth, to make sure that all the gems that are necessary for a project end up getting installed, right? So in the gem file, we just need to specify what gems we actually need. Right? In the gem file, we can also do things like split them up into different environments. There's an assets group here, for example. These are specifically the gems that are required for the asset pipeline, it's called, in Rails to work. Right? And if we wanted to, we could go in and put in other groups as well. If there was a gem, for example, that I only wanted to have available in development, then I could do group development. I put that colon in the wrong place. Something like that, and then any gems that I list here inside this group would only be installed when I'm in development mode. So when I'm working on the website here on my own computer in development mode, gems in this little group would be installed. When I actually take the website and move it over to a production server and I'm in production mode, those gems then would not be installed. Right? Okay. When you actually run the bundle command and it reads through your gem file here, what it actually produces is another file called gemfile.lock. Gemfile.lock, right, is kind of more technical, and you never actually need to edit or even really look at, in most cases, this file by hand. It's just produced automatically by Bundler. And what it does is it just goes through and it lists out very specifically exactly what version of every gem that it needs to install in order for this project to work. And all of that information is based on what it finds over in the gem file, the one that we actually do edit. Right? So you basically write your gem file, you run Bundler, it produces the gem lock file listing every gem and version, right? And then it goes through and it installs every one of those gems in that particular version. That's why whenever we start a new project and Bundler runs automatically, it takes it a minute, because there's a number of different gems in here that have to be downloaded and installed if they're not already. Right? So that's that lag that we always feel when we start a new project. Okay. What else in the gem file? Oh yeah. Up here with the Rails gem, it very specifically says Rails version 3.2.11. Right? You might notice if you look through the gem file, there are some other places in here where it has slightly different notation. Like here in the asset group, there's a gem called Uglifier. Right? The Uglifier gem, you'll notice that it specifically says version 1.0.3, but instead of just that, it says greater than or equal to. So essentially it's telling Bundler it's okay to install any version from 1.0.3 or higher, right? Would be acceptable, and then Bundler decides which version is the best. Right? It would take version 1.0.3 if it didn't find anything newer, right? or if it found other gems that may be specifically required, 1.0.3. Bundler's pretty smart and would figure all that out for us. Right? Some of the other gems that are already listed in our gem file here, like SAS Rails and Coffee Rails, they have this funny little squiggly arrow over in front of their gem version. Right? That little squiggly version, or that little squiggly arrow, essentially means any gem from this current version. So the way that these version numbers typically work is they're usually 3 digits. Right? The third digit gets incremented anytime there's a bug fix, anytime a minor change is made that doesn't overall affect the use of the gem. As long as the gem works the same way, but changes are made to it, it's typically that third number that gets changed. Right? The second number means that it was a slightly bigger change. Right? New features added, for example, something like that. But still, the second number means that the fundamental use of the gem has not changed. So essentially, whenever you're working with versions of gems, if you see changes in that second or third number, that's going to mean that you don't have to do anything to change the way you're working with that gem. The way you're using the gem will still work exactly the same way if the second and the third numbers change on you. Right? The first number, the major version, right, indicates that the gem has fundamentally changed, which probably means you will not be able to continue using it the exact same way that you used it previously. Right? Now, what the little squiggly arrow means is it's basically telling Bundler it's okay, in this case, to use any version of this gem from the 3 series, the major version 3, and it's okay to go ahead and upgrade if it's only a minor change that's been made to the gem. So if the second or the third numbers change, it's okay to go ahead and install a newer version. But don't, for example, go to version 4, right, is kind of what that squiggly arrow means. Does that make sense? All right. And what a lot of this version stuff has to do with is the fact that not only can Bundler install the initial set of gems for us when we start a new project, but we can also use it to update as we go on. If we have a project that we've been working on for a year, there's a pretty good chance that some of the gems that we used in that project have also upgraded over the course of that year while we were working on our project. So if we get a year into this project and we realize, man, I haven't updated my gems, right? I'm still working with year-old gems. Well, the bundle command has an update command, right? So I could tell my project to update my gems essentially through Bundler. And that's where these different version numbers really become important, right? If it's been a year and I started the project on Rails 3.2.11 and now 3.2.13 is out, and I say bundle update, it won't actually update the version of Rails I'm using because I specifically said use version 3.2.11. Right? But down here with SAS Rails, for example, let's say it's upgraded to version 3.4 in the last year. Well, because of the way that I've noted the version here, right? Since 3.4 is within what's allowed by the squiggly arrow, Bundler would go ahead and upgrade my SAS Rails gem to version 3.4. Right? If Coffee Rails had upgraded to version 4 and I did a bundle update on my project, it would not go to the version 4 because that's a major change and the squiggly arrow does not allow that. Right? If Uglifier down here had an extremely productive year and they were up to version 8 now, right? Bundle update would go ahead and upgrade Uglifier to version 8 because the notation greater than or equal to 103 would allow it, would basically say, yep, go as far as you need, just never go lower than 103. Does that make sense? Okay. Back over to the websites then. When I actually look up a gem on rubygems.org, they usually give me the line that I need to be able to go roughly with the current version of a particular gem that's out. So if I was going to use devise, I could basically just copy and paste this line. Right? I would be set in the 2.0 branch, the 2.0 major version of devise, and it would never update past that unless I specifically went to my gem file and told it it was okay to. Right. Another one of the little things in rubygems.org I like is down here they mention different versions. It's nice to be able to go down and actually see how active a gem is. Has it not been touched in 2 years? Or is it going through regular maintenance, regular upgrade cycles? Here with Devise, you can see that it had a lot of different versions all hit just on January 26th of this year. So just a handful of months ago, really, it looks like there was quite a bit of development still going on with it. So looks like it's an active and a maintained gem. It also mentions over here the different dependencies that it has. These are all things that basically Bundler would figure out for me. So it's good to know that they exist. Long lists of dependencies for a gem tend to make me nervous. Kind of makes everything a bit fragile. You know, if anything weird happens with any of those dependencies or those dependencies or so on, then things can go downhill really, really quickly. You know, can make things pretty frustrating. But anyway, rubygems.org, right, is there. The only real complaint I would say that I have about rubygems.org is I wish that it had more of a fuzzy matching to its search. If I, for example, was looking for a gem that did authentication, and I had never heard of the Devise gem, which is probably the most commonly used gem for authentication, if I actually went and searched for authentication on rubygems.org, you can see what it does is it just tries to make an exact match with the name. Rubygems.org doesn't really have any kind of concept of group or general use, right? So when I searched for authentication, it came back to me with a bunch of gems that actually have authentication in their name, but I don't see Devise in there anywhere, even though it's probably the most well-known, the most commonly used authentication gem there is. Since it doesn't actually have authentication in its name, rubygems.org doesn't find it. So, anyway. Right? Another website that I like for certain things is there's one called railsplugins.org. Now technically a plugin is different than a gem. Right? A gem is usually something that's installed on the system which Rails then utilizes. A plugin is actually sort of like an unpackaged gem that actually gets stuffed into your project itself. So if you were to copy your project from computer to computer, server to server, plugins would go with it, gems would not. Gems would need to be reinstalled on the new machine. I wasn't actually going to talk about plugins specifically because in Rails 4 they're going away. They're deprecated. They're not going to be used anymore. But I still wanted to mention this website because there's a nice little trick about it that I really like. Again, let me go out to railsplugins.org and search for Devise. The thing I like about Rails plugins is it's got crowdsourced information on Ruby and Rails compatibility. So this isn't information that was generated by the website itself. Instead, this is information that people have submitted. Right? And basically what it's doing is it's telling me for this particular version of Devise, it is currently not compatible with Rails 4. But it has been confirmed to work with Rails 3.2, 3.1, with Ruby 1.9, with JRuby. It's said to be thread safe. It works with Rails 3.0. Right? That's a neat little feature that this particular website seems to have that I don't tend to see on the others. Right? So sometimes before I really seriously commit to a gem, which I try to do with as much caution as I can, right? Because getting a stinker of a gem deeply buried into your project is just kind of a nightmare. It's awful to have to deal with, right? Before I really commit to a gem that's going to be really important, really critical to an application I'm writing, I always like to come out and take a look and make sure it's compatible with my development environment, with the environment that I tend to deploy in, that sort of thing. So railsplugins.org is the only one I know of that really seems to be good at doing that kind of little check, gathering that kind of information. So I just wanted to point that one out to you. One other little website that I like is the one called the Ruby Toolbox, ruby-toolbox.com. The thing I like about this one is I think it has a better search. I think it's better for discovering gems than either of the other two. The thing I like about Ruby Toolbox is not only does it know the names of the gems, but it usually also groups them together. Right? So it kind of has an idea of what the gem is meant to do, what category of gem it is. With the other two websites, for example, if I searched for authentication, I only found gems that had authentication in their name. But at Ruby Toolbox, if I search for authentication, it will actually have an authentication group, right, where it found 413 different gems that all are a part of that group, and sure enough, the very first one that comes up is the most popular one. They rank them by popularity. So that can be really nice. Right? If you know you need a gem that does something, but you don't actually know the name of a gem that does that thing, you can of course Google. Google will turn up most of these answers as well. But sometimes I think it's a little bit more streamlined to instead just come to Ruby Toolbox, search for essentially what it is that you want it to do, and let it come up and give you a list of different gems that are available. Right? So searching here for authentication, it turned devise up first, gives me some interesting statistics about it. Latest release is 10 months old, it says. First release was 3 years ago. So seems like it's being maintained and it's pretty well established. Look at that number. Right? A lot of people use devise. Is that over 1 million? Over 2 million, 2.5 million downloads of devise. Okay? Lots of others in here. The second most popular authentication related gem called OmniAuth, right, is not even to 1 million yet. Does something quite a bit different, but still basically the idea. So I think Ruby Toolbox can also be a really good resource for when you're trying to track down gems. Okay? Alright, so that's kind of the bird's eye lowdown on gems and Rails projects. Let's use one for the fun of it more than anything else. Let's say in our music example where we have albums and tracks that I wanted to be able to put in album covers. I wanted to be able to upload an album cover with an album and actually have the image of the album cover appear there with the album itself. Just for pretend, right? Let's say I don't know the name of any gems. I have no idea what gem I might want to use if I was going to do upload attachments. So here on Ruby Toolbox, if I search for attachments, there we go. It's found 64 different gems for me. I could read through them, see if any of them actually match essentially what it is that I want to do. Lots of different options. In this particular case, I know one particular gem that I actually want to use. I see some different versions of it mentioned in here. See how the word paperclip keeps turning up over and over again? Paperclip is certainly my favorite gem for doing attachments. Very easy to use. Anyway, if I were to pick one of these different websites, once I actually know the name of a gem and take a look there, paperclip, comes up and finds it for me. Paperclip looks like the current version is 3.4.1. Easy upload management for Active Record. I like the sound of that. A lot of downloads for it. Alright, so if I wanted to use this paperclip gem, from rubygems.org I could copy their little gem file line there, take it over and drop it into my gem file. Then if I jump out to the terminal, out to a command line, if I run bundle, bundle will go through, analyze my gem file, rebuild the gem.lock file, and install all the necessary gems. It's already found that most of these gems were installed. But it did in here install climate control. It installed cocaine. Wow, that's interesting. And it installed paperclip, right? I had told it to install paperclip. Why did it install those other two? Well, probably because they are dependencies of paperclip. If I actually look at my gem lock file, if I track down paperclip in here, there it is. Paperclip required cocaine, along with some other gems that I already had installed. What was the other one? Climate control. climate control got installed. There it is, because it's a dependency of cocaine. Apparently, if you want cocaine, you have to first have climate control. Who knew? Right? I'm just not hip, I guess. Don't know anything about what you need if you want cocaine. Wonder if they're going to do like a voice recognition match thing when I stick this up on YouTube and the police will come knocking on my door. You think so? Yeah, that's right. Okay, anyway, that's about all it took, right? Just drop the line into my gem file, run the bundle command, and it installed all the gems and dependencies for me. It looks like when it installed Paperclip, it also had a little note stuck here at the bottom, note for upgrading from pre-3.0 versions. Well, we're not upgrading from anything. We just added it for the very first time. So I don't think we have anything to worry about there. Okay? So now that I have the Paperclip gem actually installed, how do I use it? I don't know. I was hoping you guys would know. No? Well, usually there's going to be some documentation that goes along with it, probably a link. Right? If I click the link right there, it takes me over to rubydoc.info, where I have the documentation for Paperclip and all the other parts that go along with it. Looks pretty complicated. Right? They've got a bit of stuff in here. Doesn't look too bad. Right? Kind of a quick little rundown. What do we have in here? It mentions that Paperclip requires an image processor. The image processor it uses is called Imagemagick. Right? It talks in here about how to install Imagemagick and how to make Rails know that you have Imagemagick installed. I believe I already do have Imagemagick on my computer installed. It's pretty easy to install on a Mac. You basically just go to the terminal and run brew install Imagemagick. On Windows, I don't know how to install Imagemagick or even if it's possible. No idea. Right? Once you've got Imagemagick set up, they talk about the line you need to put into your gem file. We've already done that. Right? And then they've got a little quick start guide here. Right? In your model, if you want to use Paperclip, here's basically what you have to do. Paperclip gives us a method makes a method available to us called hasAttachedFile. Right? So if we wanted to be able to have an album cover that goes along with our albums, we would need to say that an album has attached file called cover, for example. Right? There should be another little bit in here, though. Did I skip past it? Here it is, the migrations. Right? In order for Paperclip to actually work, it needs to be able to store some additional data in the database. I don't see where they mentioned that. Do you all see anything about migrations in there? I didn't either.
Right there, number 7, back to number 6, on the right side.
Yeah, that's not what I was looking for. Yeah, it does kind of mention it there, but that's doing it sort of by hand. And hey, I'm not using Rails because I want to do this stuff by hand. Right? Let me go back a little bit. Let me go to their source code link. That takes me over to GitHub, right? Kind of the version control system that they use for Paperclip. And usually on GitHub, they have the same basic sort of information that we find there in kind of the quick start guide and the documentation. Except it seems like last time I looked at it here, I did see a mention of the generator that you can use. Oh, there it is. It might have been there in the other one and I just overlooked it. Okay. I think that's basically the line I want to run right there. Paperclip comes with its own built-in generator. Can you see that at all? Right. So that I can run Rails G Paperclip, tell it the name of the model and the name of the field, where I want to store this new upload, this new attachment. Right? And it should then automatically generate the migration I need in order to have the database be ready to handle that information. So back over on the command line, Rails G Paperclip, right? Album, right? And I want to be able to upload a cover. There, it created a migration for me called Add Attachment Cover to Albums. I'll do rake db migrate. So it's been applied to my database. Okay, with that little bit of background done, then I ought to be able to go, ready to go start working on my model. I'm just going to copy a bit of what they have here. Jump over to my album model file. There we go. And I could put in there something like what they have. I'm going to say an album has attached file called cover. Right? And then the reason Paperclip needed that image processor is because of this styles section. What this styles section lets you do is specify manipulations you want to occur to that image when you upload it. Paperclip, by the way, does work with things that aren't images. You can handle any type of file upload with it. Right? But images are very common, and with the image processor what you can do is have it automatically do things like resize or crop images when they're uploaded. So right now it's saying for my cover, the styles of it I want to have available. There will of course be the original style, but then I'm also saying that I want a medium style which will be 300 by 300 pixels. Right? If the image wasn't initially square, then this will basically make it 300 pixels in its maximum dimension. Right? And then there'll be another style over here called thumb, which will be 100 by 100 pixels, whichever one is greater. And I could add extra styles in there if I wanted as well. Right? So with that line in there, we ought to be pretty good. Right? At that point, the album should be able to have an uploaded file, have a file uploaded to it. Before I forget, I'm going to go out and actually restart my server. Usually a good idea whenever you've made any changes to your gem file. Make sure the currently running server and its environment is aware of all of the available gems. Okay. Alright. Once my albums can actually handle having uploads done to them, I then need to provide the user with a way of actually performing an upload. So let me go over to my form for albums. Currently for an album I can give it a title, an artist, a year. Maybe I also want to be able to upload an image. So let me put in a new section on my form here for my album. I'm going to say create a label for the cover. And then I'm going to say that I want a file field for the cover. If I jump over to my browser, take a look at my site as it is now, go to create a new album. In addition to the fields that I had before, I now have this new field here called cover. Right? I can click on it and actually pick a cover to upload. Right? Now, in order for that to actually work, there's also a change that I'm going to have to make to the form itself. Right? The actual form 4 method up here at the top is going to have to be modified. The trick is normally with a form, by default, a form is only expecting to upload text. If we want our form to be able to upload both text from normal fields and binary information like a file, then we have to turn our form into what's called a multi-part form. Right? In HTML we would do that by adding an attribute to our opening form tag called multi-part. Right? And then I forget the actual value we'd set to it. It's not terribly important. Right? What I would do right here is I would need to say HTML, I believe it's multi-part true, if I remember correctly. And if I'm not at all feeling confident, which I'm kind of not, right? If I go take a look at the Paperclip documentation, yeah, see right here? Basically the same thing I just put in just they're using the old hash syntax and I'm using the newer. Okay, let me go take a look at my form. The actual form itself, if I peek at it, there it is. That's what you'd normally put in if it was an HTML. Encoding type, ENC type, equals multipart / form data. I haven't had to write that by hand. I'm always used to writing it in the Rails way. Right. But essentially that tells the browser that this form, when it's submitted, isn't just going to have text in it. It's going to contain both text and binary information. That's why they call it a multi-part form. More than one part, more than one data type in it. Let me give it a shot. Let's say I'm going to create a new album called New Album 1. Artist by New Artist 1. And the year I'll say was 1111. Right. I'm going to choose a file, and before class I went ahead and downloaded some album covers. So I'll pick one of them here and I'll hit Create Album. And a bit of an error there. I added a new attribute called Cover, but I never updated my model to allow assignment to the cover attribute. So I'm going to have to go back over to my model file and add cover to my list of accessible attributes. Go back to the browser, I'll hit refresh and try it again, and it's kind of unhappy. Doesn't look like the album was ever added. Let me start the process again and see if things go any better. New album. Test album 1. Actually, that should be new. All right. New artist 1. Year 1111. Let me pick my album cover again. Create album. It looks like it created the album. There are no tracks in it right now, but the album was created. Okay. If I go back to my list of albums, yep, sure enough, there it is. If I go over and take a look at the actual Rails project itself, down under the public folder, there's a subfolder below public that wasn't there previously called System. Under System, right, there's a folder whose name matches the name of my model, Albums. Another folder that matches the name of the attribute, Covers. Right? There's an index number of some sort, an ID number. If I drill down through those, I eventually start running into actual files. Right? And this is essentially where, there it is, essentially where Paperclip actually stored the original file that was uploaded and the new versions of it that it automatically produced. It's got them all stored here under this hierarchy of folders so it can keep track of which files go with which active record model instance. So it looks like it uploaded. Right? Basically, it looks like everything has worked fine. Well, how do I actually access it then? If here on my main album list I wanted to maybe say put the thumbnail version of an album out there next to it, okay. Well, let me pull up that view template, my index view template for albums. Okay. To the left of title, let me put in a new field there. And what I should be able to do then is I should be able to say album.cover.url. Right? Album.cover, of course saying I'm talking about the cover of the album. It's basically acting like cover is just a regular old attribute. Right? But in actuality, cover is something that Paperclip put together for me. When I ask for the URL of the cover then, it should give me the path on the server that's necessary to be able to access that uploaded image. So for my first two images, my first two albums, I don't have covers for those, so I get missing.png. Right? But for the third one, right, under the system folder, albums, covers, zeros, 3, original, right, plus this weird random sort of name, right, there it actually is. Instead of just saying URL, if I said URL thumb, then it should specifically let me access the thumb version, the thumbnail version of that. And if I refresh, I can see it's a little bit different where it now has thumb in here, where before I think it had original. Yeah? Who wants to see the actual image itself? I'd much rather see a URL like this. It's quite lovely. Okay, maybe you would rather see the image itself. Yeah. If you want to see the actual image itself, what you could do then is you could take that URL and you could just pass it to the image tag helper. That would write an HTML image tag using the URL for that particular image. And there we go. As far as the two albums up here that I don't have covers for, there's a couple of different things I could do there. One was that you might have noticed before I put in the image tag, what it's actually doing for those is going to a default image called missing.png. If I wanted to create a folder called covers, thumb, and then actually make a missing.png file, then I could have sort of a default image that gets filled in. Or on the other hand, if I don't want it to show at all, I could just check for the existence of a cover before I actually go to show it. So I could do something like, say, if album.image, if album.cover. What am I doing? That should definitely be in ERB tags. So if the album has a cover, then show it. Otherwise, don't. But that didn't quite work. Right? Basically, I think it's saying that everything is considered to have a cover. It's just some covers have real names, some of them don't. What if instead of cover, if I said cover file name? There we go. Cover file name is actually one of the real fields in the database that was created for us by that paperclip migration. And what will happen is if no image has been uploaded, then cover file name will be empty, will be blank. So if I say if there is a real file name there, show an image. If it's blank though, don't do anything. So then I get my thumbnail for albums that have it, and nothing for those that don't. Okay. Over on the actual show page for an album, what you remember isn't really a show page for the album, it's the track index for that album. If I go over to my tracks index, and maybe I wanted to show the image for the album there, I could do image tag for the current album. It's covers URL. Let's say we're going to do the medium version this time. There we go. For albums that have a cover, we'll see it. If I go and look at an album that doesn't have a cover though, we have a broken image link like we did before. So again, it would just be a matter of only showing it if it's available. So we could say if at album dot cover file name. There we go. So if the album has no cover, nothing's shown. If it does have a cover, we see it. pretty easy if you've ever had to handle file uploads manually. Right? There's a lot to take into consideration when you're doing it. Right? A lot of stuff you have to worry about. Something like Paperclip makes it almost trivial. Run the little generator, go to your model file and say, this is the attachment I have. And then once that's done, it's all just little user interface things. Make sure your form lets them upload. Use it wherever it is you want to use it. Not much to it. Words of warning, little caution with attachments is usually a good idea. Right? What would happen if somebody, for example, uploaded a PHP file? Well, since all of the uploads are actually under the public directory, that means that if they could figure out the URL for it, they could actually go and run their PHP script. So if the server, besides supporting Rails, also supported PHP, you could be letting somebody basically upload any script they want and run it against your server. Do things to your database, wipe out your files, all kinds of nastiness. So you'd want to be careful with that sort of thing. Paperclip has lots of other little tools built into it to help out with that sort of thing. Right? If you go down to the validation section in the documentation, they talk about being able to validate whether an attachment is required or not. You can also, very importantly right here, validate the content type of your attachments. So you could, for example, only allow them to upload images, right? Forbidding them from uploading scripts and other types of files. There's also then lots of other little customizations you can do with something like Paperclip. Determining where the files actually get stored, for example. So taking the files that are uploaded and storing them outside of the web root, outside of that public folder, can be a good way to help alleviate some of the security problems that can result. Right? One way or another, pretty good stuff. So that's just an example of a gem. Drop it in, run bundle, and then start working with the gem. Usually, if it's a decent gem, it's going to be fairly easy to work with, hopefully well documented, and it's going to be a whole lot easier than trying to do something more complex yourself. Time saver, that's the idea. Do you have any questions? Okay. Gems were something we talked about back in Ruby class. Something else we talked about in Ruby class that we haven't yet carried over into Rails is everybody's favorite subject, which is testing. Right? Back in Ruby, we discussed the fact that test-driven development is kind of all the rage nowadays and is generally, I would say, a pretty good idea, pretty good thing to do. Right? I don't remember if I told you my honest opinion, but I kind of hate it in a way. I kind of hate testing. It's more code to write. It's more time to spend. Right? But you know what I hate more than having to write tests? That horrible feeling I get in my gut a year later when I have to update a project that I never wrote any tests for. That's the worst feeling of them all. Right? The day I get an email from my web host saying we're upgrading our version of Ruby or we're upgrading our version of Rails, and I'm sitting there wondering, is my project still going to work when they upgrade? I don't have any tests to run against it. I can't even tell for sure whether it's working right now. That's a bad feeling. So test-driven development, writing tests, is as, if not more important in Rails than it ever was in Ruby. Right? You might remember that basically the way these tests worked was more or less what we did was we called functions, called methods, worked with objects, and then we used a lot of these things called assertions. Right? Assertions were basically just checks to see if something at a particular time at a particular place was what we expected it to be. If we got the action or the result from an action that we expected. That's kind of what the tests all boiled down to. Right? In Ruby, when we did testing, it was a completely manual affair. Right? Sure, there were testing tools built in, but getting the testing going required that we create testing files, we set up the testing classes in those files, we write tests, we run the tests. right? We kind of had to bootstrap everything almost from nothing. Man, I'm spoiled. Can't believe I call that nothing, right? But one way or another, there was a lot of it that was in our hands in Ruby. In Rails, comparatively, right, when you start a new Rails project, one of the things that's automatically created for you is a test directory as part of the basic setup of the project. Under the test directory, then, there's a handful, 5 it looks like, subdirectories, plus 1 Ruby script. Okay. And essentially what happens with Rails is whenever we use a generator, if we tell it to generate a model, we tell it to generate a controller, we tell it to generate a whole scaffold, whatever it is we tell it to generate, part of that generation process typically also involves creating as much of the testing infrastructure as is possible to help us get started with testing that new feature that we've just added to our Rails project. Right? The way it essentially works down here is we have a subdirectory down here called unit. Right? Unit, the unit directory, holds what are called unit tests. Unit tests are intended to test models. Right? So whenever we generated our album and our track model, Rails automatically put in here for us an album test file and a track test file so that we could test those two models. So unit tests are about testing models. There's also then a section in here called functional. Functional tests are about testing controllers. Right? So when we generated our album controller and our tracks controller, right, the generator automatically created for us testing files for those two different controllers. So they're already there, ready to go. Okay. Besides that, there's also a subdirectory called integration, which starts off empty. Integration tests are supposed to be tests that sort of span multiple subject areas. So instead of just testing tracks by themselves or just testing albums by themselves, whether it's the model or the controller, if we wanted to test an interaction between tracks and albums, or between the models and the controllers, right? And most especially when you want to do some kind of testing that actually involves your views, that's when you would create integration tests. Integration tests are supposed to sort of mirror the user experience to a certain degree and let you kind of test that. What a lot of folks do is they only create integration tests. They don't bother with testing the models independently. They don't bother with testing the controllers individually. They just write integration tests because integration tests basically touch everything. Okay. There's also then a section in here called performance. If we wanted to write performance tests, we could do that. Actually time how long it takes for different aspects of the project to do what it's doing. Right? Define limits in how slow is too slow, that sort of thing. There's also then a subdirectory in there called Fixtures. One of the tricks with testing always is that in order to do any kind of testing, you almost always have to have some kind of data to test, right? How do we test a track if we don't have a track title and a track name and a track duration and all those other things that we talked about? How do we test an album unless we have tracks that are a part of it? Well, what fixtures are basically like little text-based YAML databases. Whatever data we put into our fixture files will get loaded into the database. So we start off with the test database with some data already in it so that we can start testing right away. Okay? There's also then one file down here in the test section called test helper. Test helper starts off without too much in it. It basically just sets the Rails environment to test. Okay? By having the Rails environment set to test, that means that it's not going to override or do anything with our development database or our production database. It gets its very own database. Right? It also could potentially have its own set of gems. Right? So it sets our development environment to that. It goes through and it actually loads our entire Rails environment. So we've got a copy of Rails that it's running in independently. Right? And then down here it actually loads all the fixtures. Loads all the data from those fixture files into the database, and that's all the test helper does by default. Okay? The test helper, though, can be edited. if you wanted to, say, write some methods to help you out with testing other things, putting them here into the test helper file would be a good place to put them, because they would then be available in all of your tests. So if you were going to write, say, a login function to mimic the experience of a user logging in, so you could then test features that are only accessible once you are logged in, you could put that login and the logout function here, method here. Right? So you could then use them from any of your other tests, probably your functional tests. Sound good? How do we actually run our tests? Go out to the command line and just type rake and hit enter. If you run the rake command with no options, it automatically assumes that what you want to do is run all your tests. So when you just type rake and hit enter, it will go through and execute every test that you have written. You can see that there was quite a few of them in there. Right? When I ran rake, it came back and told me it was running tests. It told me it was finished with the tests. Right? But then it went on down here. That might have been the unit test that it was working in right here. Then it came down and actually worked on the functional tests. I had one failure, a few tests that passed, a whole bunch of errors, and another failure in there. And each one of those then is laid out for me, saying exactly what it is that went wrong. Okay. Well, what are all these tests that it's failing? Well, like I said, when we ran our generators, it created these different testing files for us. Well, not only did it create the testing files, but it actually started them off sometimes with tests in them. Right? So here's the unit test that it created for album, the unit test it created for tracks. Right? Not a whole lot there. But if you take a look at the functional tests for albums, with the functional tests for albums, you might remember I got my albums by running the scaffold generator. It went ahead and automatically created a set of tests that would access every one of my album actions. And if I had left everything alone the way that the scaffold generator created it, these would have all passed. Right? Some of them, I think, are still passing. All right. So that's pretty nice. Created the file for me, surely. Set up the class, yeah. But then it actually even went through and wrote a bunch of tests for me. That's fantastic. I like that. Okay. Do you remember the way the test basically worked? The setup method automatically gets run before every test. Okay. So before it runs, the test should get indexed, the test should get new. Right? Before each one of the individual tests, it always runs the setup method. Okay. What is the setup method actually doing? Well, it looks like it's getting an album. Right? But what in the world is this? Albums : 1? What that's actually doing is accessing my fixture data. Albums : 1 means from the album's fixture file, get the album labeled as : 1. If I go over and look at my album's fixture, that would be this album right here. Okay. The information that's in that album is obviously as generic as it comes. I could put in more realistic information there if I wanted. Okay. But that's what that little line there means. All right. Let's take a look through some of these other tests, and maybe we can fix a few errors with them as we go through. Very first test for albums right here. Should get index. Starts off by using a special method that's available to us called get. The get method basically means send a get request. It's like clicking on a hyperlink. We're saying send a get request to index. Well, what index? Okay. The testing here is pretty smart. If I say get index, what happens is it automatically figures out that this is the tests for albums, for the album's controller. Right? So when I say get index, that means call the index method of the album's controller. Send a get request for it. Right? When it does that, It's kind of like I had typed in the URL for it or clicked a hyperlink to go to it. It goes through the router. It accesses the, or executes the actual controller action. Right? The controller action does its normal work, retrieving data from the database, which in this case is just test data. Right? And then it should send back some sort of response. So we say, send the request for the index page, and then we have our first assertion. Right? The first assertion here says, assert that our response is a success. So it's essentially looking at the HTTP status code that's being sent back, making sure it's not a 404, a 500, something that would indicate there was a problem. It's checking to make sure it's a success status code. What is the success status code? 200? I always forget that one because you just don't see it. When things go right, you don't see it. I think it's 200. Right? The next assertion it does here is to assert not nil. Right? So assert not nil means we're asserting that something isn't nil. Obviously, right? So what is it we're asserting isn't nil? Well, we have this assigns method here. Assigns albums. What that means is that in the controller action itself, there should be a variable created called @albums. Checking for assigns albums is saying, is the @albums instance variable in the index action of the albums controller not nil? Right? If I go back and I actually look at my albums controller, the albums controller in the index action, it's creating here an instance variable called @albums. It's this thing right here that we're checking to make sure is not nil. Right? Assigns :albums there. That's what it's actually checking. Right? I don't see anything wrong with that. I'd be willing to bet that in that list of errors I got when I ran my test, this was not one that failed. This must have been one of the ones that passed. Okay? Probably the same thing here for new. The second test under my albums controller sends a GET request for the new action of the current controller, the albums controller, and then simply asserts that the response is a success. Did we actually get a new page back? That should have passed okay. When we actually go to create an album, we have a new assertion in here, assert difference. Okay. By default, what assert difference does is it checks to see if a number goes up by 1 after it executes its block. So assert difference here starts off by looking at how many albums are there. Right? It remembers that number. Then it executes the statement inside the block, and then it comes back to check to see if this number has gone up by 1. Right? If it does, then assert difference is true. We pass the assertion, otherwise it's false. So what it's looking here is at the number of albums that are created, basically saying that when we call the create action of our album controller, there should be one more album at the end of it than there was at the beginning. Okay? The way we actually call the create action is we use the post method, kind of like the get methods that we had up there above. We send a post request to the create action. Something that's a little bit different about the create action, though, is that we don't just call it with no information. We have to actually provide it with information. We have to give it the details of the new album we want it to create. Okay? So we basically say, here's the information about the new album. Right? Here's its title, its artist, its year. Okay? Where did all that come from? What's this @album? Well, that's what was retrieved for us up here by our setup method. The setup method pulled a piece of data, a hunk of album data, out of the fixtures, and then used that data down here in the create test, so it had something to pass over to the create action, something to post to the create action to be created. As far as I can remember from what we did to our albums controller, I think that should still work fine. This next little piece down here below, though, I bet this is one of our failures. The last assertion we have at the end of the create test is an assert redirected to. Right? It's basically checking to see if we are redirected to the place we expected to be redirected to. At the end of create, remember we redirected to the album tracks URL right there. That assertion in the test was checking to see if we were redirected to the album path. Now that's different. That's a failure. Okay. The test is saying we should go to the album path, but the controller itself is redirecting to album's track URL. Okay. So if we want this test to pass, let me change that to album tracks path. I'll still give it the assigned album. The assigns album right here is talking about this album from the controller, the album that was just created essentially. A lot of moving parts in here, isn't there? So hopefully we just fixed a problem with one of our tests. If I jump back over to the console, we had 2 failures and 8 errors last time I ran it. If I run rake again, we have 2 failures and 8 errors. Well, that didn't fix anything at all, did it? Maybe I should look back through the actual errors themselves. You think? Let's see. Test should create album. That's the test I was just working on. Right? Line 20, album.count didn't change by 1. 3 was expected but was 2. Okay. I'm pretty sure I did just fix a problem there, but chances are that hadn't even been checked yet because it was still failing up here on the assert difference. So that's interesting. Why is that failing? Why is it not creating my new album? I'm supplying an artist, a title, and a year. What does an album need to be created? It's just an artist, a title, and a year. We just now gave albums the ability to have a cover, but we didn't make covers required. So you'd think that would be enough. Right? Was there anything else special about creating an album? Oh, what about this? We validated that a new album's year had to be numerical. The actual data that we're passing comes from our fixtures, and the year that we're trying to use to create that new album is not numeric. So what if I change those year values so that they are numeric? Try running my tests again. One failure and 8 errors. Yep, we fixed a failure. If I come back up and take a look, doesn't look like we're having a problem with create anymore. It's one of the things that always drives me crazy about tests. Nothing wrong with the test itself, nothing wrong with the controller. The only thing that was wrong was bad data being fed into it all. That seems to have fixed it. What's the next error we're getting? Test should show album. Action not found. The action show could not be found in album's controller. Well, yeah, that's quite true. I deleted it. So it's not there anymore. So I probably don't need the test for it. There we go. Run my tests again. What do we have now? Should update album. Expected response to be a redirect to one place, but it was a redirect to somewhere else instead. Okay. Probably that same little problem that I had just fixed up in create. Here under the update test, it's asserting that we're redirecting to album path, but in actuality in the album's controller after an update, we redirect to album's tracks path. So if I change this to make sure, change the assertion so that it actually goes along with what I'm really doing, album tracks path, that ought to fix up that test. Down to 0 failures, 7 errors. First one is with creating a track. Are we down to tracks at this point? Does that mean that all of our album tests are passing now? Yeah, it looks like everything in here has to do with tracks now. Do we have time to fix our track tests? Maybe. No, probably not. We'll have to play with them a little bit, right? One of the things that will make tracks just slightly more complicated is we need to actually, in our data, set up the relationship between tracks and albums. Right? You can see it shows here that every track has an album, but it doesn't specify what it is. So we're going to have to fix that little bit up. Okay? Once we do, though, we can go ahead and finish off and get all the tests passing for our little album example here. Once we do that, what I wanted to do next was start a new project, but instead of doing it backwards like we're doing this one where we code first and then test, we'll write a new project, we'll start a new project, and we'll test first the way that we're actually supposed to. Write a test, let it fail, write the code that passes the test. That old pattern. Okay? I was thinking about a little to-do application. With the little to-do application, I thought maybe we'd start by writing it pretty traditionally. Right? And then we'll be able to come back and play with it. Maybe I can show you some Ajax stuff. Ajax is always kind of neat. So work on that later. Can I answer questions? All right. Hope you all have a good afternoon. I'll see you day after tomorrow, unless I've gone to jail for promoting the use of the cocaine gem.